My cheating wife returned from dinner with her boss to find I had vanished, and I mean that literally. No note explaining where I'd gone, no angry voicemail, no dramatic scene waiting for her in the living room. Just an apartment that was quieter than she'd ever heard it. A closet with gaps where my clothes used to hang, and 5 words on the kitchen counter written on a piece of notebook paper in my handwriting. I finally did the math. She called me 47 times in 4 hours. The 48th call went to Jonah, who told her, simply, that I'd asked him not to answer either. The night it actually started, not the night I left, but the night I stopped being surprised, was a Tuesday in February, about 6 weeks earlier. Elena had texted me at 6:15, "Client dinner, don't wait up." I was sitting at the kitchen table with my laptop open, doing what I always did after work, which was reconciling the household budget in a shared spreadsheet that Elena had stopped looking at sometime around our 2nd anniversary. I read her message, set the phone down, and realized I wasn't surprised, not even a little. That should have registered sooner, probably, the not being surprised part. But I'd gotten good at treating my own observations as unreliable. That's a skill you develop slowly, the same way you develop any habit, through repetition, through enough small moments of being told you're overthinking until you start thinking it yourself. I want to be clear about something before I go further. I'm not someone who makes decisions fast. I'm a financial analyst. I look at numbers until a pattern becomes undeniable, and then I act on the pattern. What I'd been doing for 6 months was looking at a pattern I didn't want to confirm, because confirming it meant the math of my entire adult life needed to be recalculated. The Denver job. The friends I'd let drift because they were low energy. 3 years of Tuesday nights. The Denver thing still bothers me more than I usually admit. 2.5 years ago, my firm's parent company offered me a position that would have jumped me 2 levels, senior analyst to associate director. The kind of offer that usually comes with a relocation package and a story you tell at dinner parties. I didn't take it. Elena's firm had 1 U.S. office. Her trajectory, as she put it, was ascending, and mine was stable. I agreed. I told myself it was a partnership decision, the kind of long-game thinking that serious couples do. I received a lateral move 14 months later. She was promoted 6 months after that. I was still sitting with all of this when my phone buzzed with a message from a contact I'd saved simply as P. Anand. Priya was Elena's colleague, someone I'd met at a company holiday party twice, someone I associated with the specific awkwardness of being the quieter spouse at professional social events. Her message was 3 words followed by a screenshot. "I'm sorry. I thought you should know." The screenshot was a text exchange between Elena and a contact saved as DV. I knew who DV was. Daniel Voss was Elena's boss. 41 years old, also married, the kind of professionally polished person who made you feel slightly underdressed even in a casual conversation. I'd met him once, at my own firm's holiday dinner, of all places, where he'd attended as a +1 for someone else, and spent a significant portion of the evening talking to Elena with the relaxed fluency of people who have already said everything difficult and arrived somewhere comfortable. The messages in the screenshot were not explicit. They didn't need to be. "Can't wait to see you tonight," sent at 7:14 p.m. on a date I recognized immediately, because that was the night Elena had told me she was presenting to a client in Philadelphia. I had made dinner that night. I remembered because I'd looked up a recipe she'd mentioned wanting to try, and I'd felt unreasonably pleased with myself for remembering. I set my phone on the table and opened a new spreadsheet. I named it Personal Ledger. The first entry I made was the Denver offer, the salary difference, compounded over 3 years, assuming a standard progression. I didn't do anything else for about 20 minutes. Then I called Jonah. Jonah has been my closest friend since our 2nd year of college, and he has a gift for identifying the correct response to situations faster than I do. When I explained what I was looking at, he said, "Tell her you know." I said I wasn't ready to tell her I knew. He asked what I was ready for. I said, "To stop being surprised." The next morning I opened a personal checking account. Not for any dramatic reason, I told myself, just to see what it felt like to have money she didn't know about. It was the first financial decision I'd made independently in 3 years, and the fact that it felt foreign is its own answer about the shape the marriage had taken. I spent the following days paying attention in a way I hadn't allowed myself to before. I had access to our shared calendar. We'd set it up in the first year. That particular optimism of people who believe shared scheduling is a form of intimacy. I cross-referenced her client dinner entries against what I could observe of her actual client communications, which I wasn't technically surveilling, I was just noticing. 3 of the Tuesday dinners in the past 6 weeks corresponded to no clients I'd ever heard her mention. They did correspond to a restaurant 2 blocks from an address I found by looking up Daniel Voss's firm online. I photographed the relevant joint card receipts on my phone and created a folder. I didn't call it evidence. I called it the ledger. Old habits. Living in the apartment after that was an exercise in a particular kind of acting. Elena came home that first Tuesday, energized and warm, poured herself a glass of wine, asked what I was working on. I closed the laptop. Budget stuff, she said, in exactly the tone she always used. You and your spreadsheets. And I smiled in exactly the way I always had. But I was already in a different conversation with myself, one that had been running in the background for longer than I'd wanted to admit, and had finally become the main event. She had no idea she was already in one. The weeks that followed had a strange double quality, like watching a movie while also being inside it. On the surface, nothing in the apartment had changed. Elena and I made dinner on Wednesdays, watched whatever she'd queued on the streaming service, discussed her work in the general terms she preferred. Underneath, I was dismantling 3 years of shared infrastructure with the same quiet methodology I'd have used on any complex analysis. One line item at a time, in the correct order, without announcing the project. The ledger grew. I added the hotel charge I found on the joint card. One night, billed during a work retreat Elena had described as company only at a hotel 20 minutes from our apartment. Checkout was noon. Her flight to the retreat had been at 7 a.m. I didn't say anything about it. I photographed the statement and added it to the folder with the date, the amount, and a brief note about the timeline discrepancy. The folder was getting methodical in a way that would have impressed me professionally if the subject matter had been anything other than my own marriage. I called Jonah on a Thursday evening from a parking garage near my office because I'd started being careful about where I had certain conversations. I told him everything in order: the Priya screenshot, the calendar cross-references, the hotel. He went quiet in that specific Jonah way. That means he's running the information through some internal filter before he responds. Then he said, "She's going to say you were having a breakdown." I said I knew. He said, "That's why the spreadsheet has dates." I said exactly. Jonah came with me when I looked at the new apartment. It was 12 blocks from the old one. A 1-bedroom on the 4th floor with a small kitchen and a window that faced a building instead of a street, which I actually preferred. Less noise. It was smaller than what I had with Elena by a significant margin, and it cost less, and the lease had only my name on it. Jonah made a joke about the size. Then he looked at the kitchen and said it had good light. He was trying to make it feel like a choice rather than a retreat. I appreciated that. The process of physically moving things was something I planned in stages, taking only what wouldn't be noticed as missing. Books, financial documents, the hard drive with my work files and personal backups, clothes that lived in the back of the closet. I've moved 3 times in my adult life, and I know which boxes matter. The furniture could stay. We'd bought most of it together, and I wanted none of it. I didn't want things that would require a negotiation. I wanted a clean ledger. The conversation with Gretchen, our landlord, a direct woman in her 60s who managed 4 buildings in the neighborhood and had an encyclopedic memory for every lease term she'd ever written, was straightforward. Our joint lease had 47 days remaining. I asked about renewing under a single name. She explained the process. The existing joint lease would lapse at its expiration, and a new agreement could be drawn with any qualified tenant who provided the required 60-day notice beforehand. I had done the timeline correctly. The new lease, in my name only, was filed 9 days later. Gretchen didn't ask many questions. She was the kind of person who respected preparation. I also noticed, somewhere around week 3, that my name had been removed from the building's emergency contact list. Elena had updated it to her mother without mentioning it to me. I found it through the building's resident app, which we'd both downloaded when we moved in. I took a screenshot and added it to the folder. It was a small thing, practically speaking, but it told me she'd been doing her own kind of editing, just quieter than I'd given her credit for. There was one evening that almost stopped me. Elena made the pasta dish she knew I liked, the one with the lemon and the capers, a recipe she'd found in our first year. We sat at the kitchen table and she was funny about something that had happened at work. Not the work involving Daniel, just ordinary office absurdity. And I laughed, genuinely, because she had always been funny. That was one of the first things about her. We talked for almost an hour, and she asked about a project I was running at my firm, and listened to my answer in a way that felt real. I drove home from Jonah's that night. I'd started having dinner at his place once a week, ostensibly because we were getting older and saw each other less, actually because I needed somewhere to think clearly. And I sat in my car for 15 minutes before going upstairs. I told myself I was being thorough. I was actually being afraid. There's a difference, and that was the night I finally stopped pretending I didn't know which one it was. I saved Elena's contact photo that night. I didn't delete it until 2 weeks later. One afternoon, about a week before I was ready to finalize everything, I had a casual conversation with Owen Park, the HR coordinator at my firm, about disclosure policies at client-facing companies. I framed it as a general question about industry norms, which was technically true. Owen explained the standard. At most professional services firms, relationships between supervisors and direct reports required formal disclosure to HR. I asked what happened if someone didn't disclose. He said it depended on the firm, but that undisclosed relationships carried significant risk when they surfaced. I said that made sense. We moved on to a different topic. I didn't mention Elena. I didn't plan to. The near discovery happened on a Wednesday. Elena came home 40 minutes earlier than expected and found a box near the hall closet. She stopped and looked at it. I said I was clearing out old things, donating clothes. She opened the box. It was clothes. I'd planned for that possibility, which was either smart or the kind of thing you don't want to examine too closely. She accepted the explanation, started to move toward the kitchen, then stopped and turned back. "Have you been in my email?" she asked. My pulse did something complicated. I kept my expression level and said, "Why would I be in your email?" She held the question for a beat too long. Then, "Never mind, long day." She went to the kitchen, and I stood in the hallway, understanding that the dynamic had shifted. She suspected I knew something, which meant she was about to start managing me actively, and I had approximately 1 week before her management became more strategic than my preparation. I moved the last boxes to the new apartment the following Thursday, while she was at work. I left the furniture. I left her kitchen things. I left the streaming service subscriptions in her name. I kept my books, my documents, my hard drive, and my coffee maker, which had been mine before the marriage and which I'd always felt she'd annexed without discussion. There's something clarifying about knowing exactly which objects are actually yours. The note I placed on the kitchen counter was on a piece of paper torn from a legal pad. Nothing ceremonial about it, just the pad I kept by the couch for working at home. 5 words, my handwriting. I finally did the math. I turned off my location sharing. I drove to the new apartment. I sat on the floor because the furniture hadn't arrived yet and ate a granola bar and watched my phone. It started ringing at 9:47 p.m. I watched it ring. 47 calls over the following 4 hours, which I know because I counted them the way you count things when your hands need something to do. The 48th went to Jonah, who told me later that Elena had asked if I was safe, and he'd said yes, and she'd asked where I was, and he'd said I'd asked him not to answer that. She'd then called my mother, Diane Ellery, my mother, who lives 3 hours away and makes soup when she's worried and had genuinely liked Elena, had no idea where I was, but she'd called me as soon as Elena hung up, and I did answer that one. She called me, my mother said you left without warning, said she's worried about your mental health. I told her I was sitting on the floor of a new apartment eating a granola bar. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's quite a floor to be sitting on." I said it was a good apartment. She said, "Did you make a considered decision?" I said, "I made a spreadsheet." She didn't laugh exactly, but I could hear her deciding not to. She said, "I'll call you Sunday," and hung up, which is my mother's version of, "I'm on your side and I trust you and I don't need the details tonight." Elena had made her first move. She'd started constructing a story, stressed husband, sudden disappearance, worried wife, before I'd finished leaving. She was quick. I'd always known she was quick. What I hadn't fully understood until I was sitting on that empty floor was how long I'd been letting her be quick on my behalf, and how much slower that had made everything else. 1 week after I left, I was eating delivery food at a folding table in my new apartment when Jonah arrived with coffee and information. He set both on the table with the same gesture, which told me the information was the kind that needed the coffee first. "She's telling people you had a breakdown," he said. "Stress-related. She's using the word mental a lot." I drank some coffee. "How many people?" The usual group, your firm's holiday dinner crowd, maybe 6, 7 people. I knew which people. The ones Elena had cultivated over 3 years into a social circle that was nominally shared, but functionally hers. I thought about that dinner 2 years ago, Daniel Voss arriving as someone else's guest, spending the evening talking to my wife with the ease of people who'd already crossed the hard distances. I'd been in that room, I'd refilled my own drink and come back to find them laughing at something and thought, they seem comfortable with each other. They'd filed it and moved on. That's what I did. I filed things. 3 of those mutual friends texted me within 2 days of each other, which told me the conversations had happened close together. The messages were variations on the same careful concern. Hey, just checking in. Heard you've been going through something? One asked more directly whether it was true I'd been struggling with anxiety. I sat with that particular message for a few minutes, feeling the specific frustration of watching someone else's explanation of your life arrive in your own inbox. I responded to each one individually with the same sentence. I'm well. Thanks for asking. I'll explain when I can. No more than that. Elena's version had a head start, but I'd worked in financial analysis long enough to know that a premature counter-narrative is usually weaker than a well-timed one. Elena's texts arrived in clusters. Please just tell me you're safe. Then, I'm not angry, I just need to know you're okay. Then, an hour later, your mother is worried. That one was calculated, and I noticed the calculation, which was itself a kind of progress. A few months earlier, I might have read it as genuine concern. Now I read it as a resource being deployed. I called my mother before I called anyone else. Diane said Elena had phoned again, that she'd sounded composed and sad, and had used the phrase, I think he just needs support right now, which my mother relayed with a certain dry precision that told me she'd already formed her own opinion. I said I was fine. She said she knew. She told me she'd sent 3 recipes and that I needed to stop ordering delivery. I said I would. I ordered delivery for 11 more days after that, but the recipes are still in my inbox and I've made 2 of them, which feels like reasonable progress. Elena eventually asked to meet. She suggested our apartment, the apartment, and I said I'd prefer somewhere neutral. I chose a coffee shop near my office, public, well lit, the kind of place where scenes are difficult to sustain. She arrived looking composed in the way that takes effort to maintain, the kind of composure that is itself a performance for whoever might be watching. She ordered something at the counter. She sat down across from me. I don't understand what happened, she said. I know I've been distracted with work. I know I haven't been as present as I should be. Distracted with work was doing significant structural labor in that sentence, and we both knew it. I asked her one question. The Tuesday you were supposed to be in Philadelphia, I said. Where were you actually? She said Philadelphia. She said it without hesitation, which told me she'd prepared for this, had run the conversation in advance and decided on her position. I said I knew she hadn't been. She set down her cup and told me my anxiety was making me see patterns that weren't there, that she was worried about me, that she'd been worried for a while, actually, that I'd been under a lot of stress, that she'd thought about suggesting. I put the hotel receipt on the table. It was a printout, folded once, nothing dramatic. Joint card transaction, date, amount, hotel name, checkout at noon. Her flight had been at 7 a.m. She looked at it, not at me, at the paper, the way you look at something when you're calculating what it can and cannot prove. Then she said, How did you get that? It's my account, I said. She tried the work angle. She'd needed a quiet space the night before. An early flight meant she couldn't afford to lose sleep over a commute. She hadn't mentioned it because she knew I'd read into it. Reasonable explanations assembled quickly. She was good at this. She'd always been good at this. And under different circumstances, I might have felt the old familiar gravity of her certainty pulling against mine. Checkout was noon, I said. Your flight was 7 a.m. Something shifted in her expression. Not the composure, she held that, but something behind it, a recalculation happening in real time. She changed direction. She said she couldn't believe I'd been tracking her, that this kind of behavior was exactly what she'd been trying to address, that she had concerns about my state of mind that she'd been too gentle about raising, and that she was raising them now because she cared. I'm not asking you to explain, I said. I'm explaining why I left. The lease came up when she said she wanted to go home, that she needed her things, that we needed to have a real conversation somewhere private. She said the coffee shop wasn't the right place. I said she should contact Gretchen about retrieving her belongings, that the new lease was in my name. She looked at me with the specific expression of someone encountering an obstacle they hadn't planned for. "I'm on the lease," she said. "The previous lease expired 3 weeks ago," I said. "The renewal is mine. Gretchen can confirm." I watched her decide not to believe me. She took out her phone. I understood what she was doing. She was going to call Gretchen in this public coffee shop and correct me in front of ambient witnesses, and use the correction to re-establish the version of the situation in which I was confused and she was the steady one. I didn't stop her. Gretchen answered on the second ring. Elena asked about the apartment lease, her name, the renewal status. Gretchen, who manages 4 buildings and has an encyclopedic relationship with her own paperwork, confirmed the current lease was in a single name. She confirmed it was mine. She confirmed the prior joint lease had expired and the new agreement had been executed following proper 60-day notice as permitted under the original terms. Elena thanked her and ended the call. The composure took a visible effort to maintain after that. She said what I'd done was vindictive, that I'd been planning this while pretending everything was fine, that the deception was mine, that I had been the one hiding something. I opened my phone and placed it on the table facing her. The ledger on screen, 2 years of financial contributions broken out by category, the Denver offer with the salary differential compounded across 3 years, the joint card transactions at the restaurant 2 blocks from Daniel's office, the hotel receipt with timestamps, the emergency contact change with the screenshot date, the Priya message and its timestamp against Elena's claimed Philadelphia itinerary, all of it organized by date with brief factual notes. Nothing inflammatory in the language, just entries. I said, I did the math. She stared at the screen for long enough that the coffee shop noise filled the silence on its own. She didn't ask about Daniel. She didn't ask about Priya. She said very quietly, "How long?" "Long enough," I said. I learned what happened professionally about 10 days later. Not from Elena, not from anyone who had any reason to tell me. Jonah heard it from a contact at a different firm who knew someone at Elena's company. Daniel Voss had filed a voluntary HR disclosure. He'd named the relationship, described it as mutual, and characterized it as ending. The disclosure named Elena and flagged that she had not filed a corresponding report despite the supervisory nature of the relationship, which was a violation of the firm's stated policy. Daniel apparently had decided that preemptive disclosure served his interests better than waiting to be discovered, which was its own complete answer about what he'd been protecting throughout this entire arrangement. He'd disclosed to manage his own risk, and the disclosure had landed on Elena's record with the same force it would have if someone else had filed it. She was under formal review. I hadn't reported anything. Priya hadn't filed anything. Daniel had done it himself. I found I didn't feel triumphant about that exactly. I felt something more like recognition. The man Elena had chosen to risk her marriage for had, when risk became personal, protected himself first. That was the actual math of what she'd traded for. I noted it and moved on. Priya, through Jonah, had contradicted Elena's narrative with 2 colleagues directly, telling them she'd been the one to send me the screenshot, that she'd seen what was happening and thought I deserved to know. She wasn't coordinating with me. She just didn't want the breakdown story to stand in rooms she occupied, and she had the standing to correct it. That was enough. Elena called one more time. Not about the apartment, not about logistics, not with a new framing strategy. She called on a Sunday evening when I was cooking, actually cooking, one of the recipes my mother had sent, which felt like evidence of something, and I answered because I'd decided I would answer once and then I would be finished. She said I could have just talked to her. I said I had. I reminded her of the Denver conversation, of the dinners I'd mentioned, of the evening I'd said I felt like a line item in a budget I hadn't approved. She'd told me I was anxious. She'd told me I was reading into things. I stopped talking, I said, when I understood that you weren't listening. You were just waiting for me to finish. She said she'd never meant for any of it to happen this way. I told her I believed her. I did believe her, actually. She hadn't planned for it to become what it became. She just made choices and assumed the rest of the structure would hold. That doesn't change what it cost, I said, and let the silence sit until she ended the call. The divorce was handled without courtroom drama. I contacted a lawyer, began the process, and Elena cooperated in the way people cooperate when the alternative is a contested proceeding that would require the ledger to enter formal discovery. We split cleanly. I did not touch her half of the joint account. I left it for her to claim and close my access. I didn't want her money. I'd never wanted her money. I wanted my own. The mutual friends resolved the way these things usually do, not with a dramatic collective verdict, but with a slow redistribution. A few stayed in her orbit. 2 reached out to me directly over the following months, in the careful way of people who'd received one version of a story and were now recalibrating. One of them said, "I think I got one side of things." I said, "There usually are 2. We got coffee. I didn't go further than that. My new apartment stopped feeling like a retreat somewhere around month 2. I bought furniture I actually chose. A desk chair, a decent lamp, a kitchen table that fit the space rather than competing with it. I bought a second desk chair out of old Reflex and returned it 2 days later. The refund was $43. It was the smallest financial decision I'd made in years and one of the more satisfying ones. I cook on Sundays now. I call my mother after. She asks about the recipes and I give her an honest accounting. The project at work I'd been deferring, a process restructuring that would have required me to advocate for myself with some energy, I completed and presented in February. My manager said it was the clearest financial analysis she'd seen from my team in 2 years. I said I'd had a productive stretch. The note is still with me, the original piece of legal pad paper with 5 words in my handwriting. Elena photographed it at some point, maybe that first night, maybe after, maybe to show people as part of the breakdown narrative, and what those people saw was a fragment without context, a man leaving without explanation. What I know it is, reading it now, is a statement of fact. I had done the math. I had added up the Denver offer and the calendar discrepancies and the hotel checkout time and 3 years of Tuesday nights, and the sum was a number I could no longer balance against what I was receiving. I had it framed, nothing elaborate, simple black frame, off-white matte, the paper slightly wrinkled because I'd folded it before I put it on the counter. It hangs in my apartment now, in the small hallway between the kitchen and the living room, which is not a gallery wall kind of person, which I'm not. I don't display things as a rule. That one I kept. Not to remind myself to be angry. I'm mostly not angry anymore, which surprised me. Not as a trophy, more as a receipt. The first true sentence I'd written in that apartment in a long time, which happened to also be the last.